but I'll just read two of the lines in the proviso. Budget provisos are the type of things that they stick into must-pass bills, the budget must-pass bill, that they couldn't pass a standing bill on. And they do it every year, and they're supposed to just be for 1 year, and they can renew it. But the one that is particularly explains what our concerns are is that you cannot teach or consider an individual by virtue of their race or sex to be inherently racist, sexist, oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. And in their press release, they use the term white privilege. And so they're very concerned about telling young white children that they have some kind of privilege by virtue of being white. Can't do that. And the other one I thought that was particularly relevant is that an individual should not feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his race or sex. And so that's, again, wrapping their concerns about protecting children from being uncomfortable about history. And Cecil, I'm going to kick it over to you, and you can take it any way you want to, stop and take questions, but talk to us about how we got in this mess and what you think we can do about it.
As Brett said, my name is Cecil Cahoon. I have been an organizational specialist. That's the glorified title that the National Education Association gives to those of us who are regional organizers. For most of my 17 years at NEA, I have worked primarily in the southeastern states, which includes my adopted home state of South Carolina, where I've lived for the past 20 years and 5 months, but who's counting? And although I am an NEA employee, I want to emphasize that I'm not here tonight representing NEA, but rather speaking on my own behalf as a student of South Carolina history and a former staff member of the South Carolina Education Association, and somebody who is heavily invested in public education in the state. As Brett teed up for me, how we got to where we are rests heavily on our understanding of how public education has been treated in the state from the very beginning. In fact, going back to before statehood for South Carolina, by those who are in power, and the efforts that were made to establish public education in the first place, and why and by whom, and then the efforts that were undertaken to undermine or weaken or keep control over public education, and the efforts that were undertaken to organize a power base among educators in the state, and then the efforts that were undertaken to weaken the power base of organized educators in the state. And so for the purposes of that kind of a conversation, I have created a sort of a chronology of notes, and I dropped that document in the chat box. It's a Word document, about 9 pages or so. I'm not going to read that word for word to you tonight, but I'm going to skim it for you in order to establish some major themes. This came actually from a Facebook essay that I posted just after election night a month or so ago, in a document that I called an essay that I called "The Dividends of Division," because I sought in that document to explain what I'm going to discuss here, and that's how we got to where we are. And so I'll begin in the very infancy of South Carolina. You know, Charleston was founded in 1670. Well, by 1712, the colonial government in Charleston approved legislation to open a free school in Charlestown. This was in 1712, before there was a North or a South Carolina, when it was still just Carolina. And the government in Carolina, operating out of Charleston, appropriated funds to open a free school in Charlestown. But that school was owned and operated and instructed by Anglicans, representatives of the Anglican Church. It was a prototype for parochial education in the state for the children, expressly for the children of well-to-do white colonists. Fast forward to the late 1700s, and you get to the 1770s, 80s, and 90s. A series of governors of the state, Arnoldus Vanderhorst, Charles Pinckney, John Drayton, and James Burchell Richardson, all made public statements between 1794 and 1803 in support of, for various reasons, reflecting their own political philosophies, in support of a kind of public education. Now, public education to them meant education for the heirs of wealthy white families in the brand new South Carolina, the state of South Carolina, not necessarily for everybody. But other people were having different ideas. There was a Revolutionary War hero named Robert Coram, who settled in Charleston after the Revolutionary War and took up printing pamphlets. And he printed a pamphlet in which he first espoused the wholesale redistribution of land statewide that had been granted previously by the Crown to loyalists to the Crown. Now that it's a state, he said we need to redistribute land on a wholesale basis to American citizens living in South Carolina, and we need to institute universal public education as a public good for everybody in the state. That was Robert Coram. Just a few years later, a Charleston congressman, Richard Beresford, published a famous pamphlet called Aristocracy, the Bane of Liberty, learning the antidote. And that in that pamphlet, he too promoted universal public education as a public good. This notion that public good comes from, in fact, the word republic itself, the Latin res publica, the public thing, not the private thing, but the public thing is what republic means. And these men were classical Republicans who were advocating for public goods like public education, public services, public safety, et cetera, et cetera. However, their efforts came to almost nothing except for the Anglican church schools that had popped up across the colony in the early state. And in 1801, the incorporation of South Carolina College at Columbia, now known as University of South Carolina. And why? Because wealthy white planters were tired of seeing their sons and heirs go up north for education, meet Chastity Prelo up in Philadelphia and not come home. So in order to keep their sons home, they opened South Carolina College in 1801. That was the result of all of those many decades of efforts to enact public education in South Carolina. In 1811, a state representative named Robert Elliott proposed a Free Schools Act in the legislature. This was the very first piece of legislation for public education in the state, and it was enacted. It established public schools could be open in every district of the state. This is specific language, in every district of the state, as many as that district had representatives in the legislature. Well, nearly every school represented a district of its own, and it had its own little school board. It's sort of the prototypical charter school model. And because there were so many districts in the state, at one time there were more than 1,100 of them. There were 1,100 school districts in the state. And the legislature did not appropriate funds to fund public education in the state. So it was all for naught. It was up to the local communities themselves to raise money to open a one-room schoolhouse and to hire a teacher, so long as they could keep a teacher for the months of the year that their kids were not working in the fields and making money through agriculture. That was 1811. You may know that the late 1700s is known as the Age of Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment era. When that ended, the Great Awakening swept across the South, including South Carolina, and parochialism took hold. There was no progress made between the 1810s and the 1850s in the way of establishing public education. In 1850s, you get individual businessmen like Christopher G. Memminger in Charleston, who was sort of a do-good, wanting to promote Charleston as a good place to live and a good place to be, opening with other like-minded business people in that city, opening a free school, what he called a free school for the children who lived in that city. Strangely enough, it included both boys and girls, and it included both the children of free black and white citizens in Charleston. That was in 1850. It operated only until 1861, when the opening of the Civil War closed Memminger's schools. So from 1861, from the firing on Fort Sumter until the war was over, there really were only a few what we would consider public schools operating in the state. And the most notable of them is still known as the Penn Center. The Penn Center, where a couple of Philadelphia-based missionary teachers, Laura Towns and Ellen Murray, came down to teach the children of freed slaves in the Sea Islands. So that was, for all intents and purposes, a public school, and it was one of the few public schools operating in the state through the Civil War. Of course, after the Civil War ended, the majority Black Reconstruction legislature called for a constitutional convention. And once they declared themselves human beings, the next thing that they did was that they established public education as a public good and gave it its own article in the state constitution. One of the important things that they did in that article was to establish an independently elected state superintendent of education. A state superintendent of education who is not an appointee of a governor or any other body or individual, and therefore is free to advocate for public education itself, to, in my words, be a champion for public education. But even that legislature could not fully fund public schools statewide in the places where public schools still existed, because white folks who still owned and farmed arable land resented having to pay taxes to educate other people's children when their own children perhaps had gone off and died in the war, and other people's children now included the children of their former slaves. So there was no mechanism for fully funding public education in the state, even through Reconstruction. Then when Reconstruction ended in 1877, the hopes for public education might have died and gone away there, except for the newly created and newly elected state superintendent of education, a man named Hugh S. Thompson, who was elected in 1876 for the first time, was reelected in 78 and again in 80. In 82, he was elected governor. And Hugh S. Thompson, in fact, he only left the governor's office to become something like an assistant secretary of the Treasury for Grover Cleveland. So while Hugh S. Thompson was superintendent of education and governor of South Carolina, Thompson moved mountains to do something that had not been done before, and that was to organize the state's educators into a power base. Now, an organization of the state's educators had been attempted as early as 1850. There was a meeting in Columbia that was called the First Teachers Convention. At that meeting, they named themselves the Teachers Association of South Carolina. There were only 41 elected delegates there from across the state. But as soon as that convention adjourned, it went out of existence. That was in 1850. 7 years later, though, in 1857, up in Wisconsin, a group of educators from all across the country got together and founded what they named the National Teachers Association. And at that meeting in 1857, there were 43 persons who signed its founding document, and 2 of them were from South Carolina, J.D. Giddings of Charleston and P.F. Smith. Where P.F. Smith was from, I don't know. The National Teachers Association became, some years later, the National Education Association. So it is safe to say, I mean, it's documentary evidence that educators in South Carolina were part of the effort to establish the National Education Association. Their names are on the founding documents. Thanks to Hugh Thompson, though, the third attempt to create a state teachers association, I'm sorry, I skipped the second time. A second attempt was made in 1870. That time, the State Convention of Teachers, was what they called themselves, elected Hugh Thompson as their president. This was 1870. 1870, 6 years before the president of that convention was elected state superintendent of education. So being elected by organized educators in the state provided him a platform to run for state superintendent. He ran, he won in 1876, was reelected twice more, and that gave him a platform to run for governor. while he was in those offices, then he was the motivator behind the third attempt to create the state organization of public school educators, and that's in 1881. In that year, he spoke to 125 delegates of the State Teachers Association, later to be named the South Carolina Education Association, and affiliated then formally with the National Education Association. Officers were elected, governing documents were ratified for the organization that marks its 141st anniversary this year, 141 years. Of course, state law at that time in South Carolina prohibited the mingling of Black and white educators in one organization. Despite that fact, Thompson initiated what he called institutes for colored teachers as early as 1880. That evolved into normal training schools, which were preparatory programs for teachers. And from those institutes came the formation in 1900 of the Palmetto Education Association, PEA, the state's first organization for Black educators in South Carolina. So in 1881, you get the formation of the white SCEA, and in 1880, you get the formation of the Black Palmetto Education Association, PEA. From 1890, then these two organizations operated as sort of twin organizations. In fact, all the way up to the 1960s, they operated, I wouldn't go so far as to say hand in hand, but sort of like two hands on the same body, because where the all-white SCEA made some efforts to win what they could win through legislation, lobbying at the State House, the all-Black PEA made its gains where they could make gains through litigation, through going to court and fighting for rights under federal law, if not under state law. All right, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. So from 1900 or so, from the late 1890s to 1967, SCEA and PEA existed and operated on these parallel tracks. And they accomplished a couple of amazing things. One of them was the establishment of the state retirement system. The other was the establishment of the state health plan. So when you take into consideration all of the public and municipal employees in South Carolina today who enjoy benefits under the state health plan, or who enjoy retirement benefits to the extent that they are enjoyable under the state retirement system, both of those came into being because the SCEA and PEA, on behalf of educators in the state, fought to get those established. Of course, in 1954 came Brown v. Board, and South Carolina's record of response to Brown v. Board is particularly shameful. Everything that happened from 1951, and there's a great long list of, when you talk about hits and misses, there are more misses than hits. Almost everything that happened illustrates, to my mind, a simple guiding principle, and that is, to conservatives, public education is a public good only so long as conservatives can control its funding and curriculum, and only so long as it remains segregated. If the funding and curriculum is not in the hands of conservatives, and if the right to high quality public education is afforded to every child in an integrated setting, then to conservatives, public education is no longer a public good. So everything that happens after 1951 to and through the Brown v. Board decision is an illustration in my mind of this. In 1952, Governor Jimmy Burns led the legislature to put public education itself in a referendum on the ballot. He had campaigned on the promise that if the Supreme Court happened to declare segregation unconstitutional, he would close public schools in South Carolina. He put it on the ballot in 1952, and by a margin of 2-1, South Carolinians supported that referendum. So the referendum language said, if and when the state legislature finds it necessary and good to close public schools statewide, they are authorized to do so. So the legislature held that in their back pocket for the next 20 years as they did a whole lot of other things. In 1955, the legislature repealed compulsory attendance. They repealed the law on school terms, dictating how long a school year had to be. They gave local school boards the authority to lease or sell public school property to private entities in order to open private schools. The notion was that the Supreme Court and federal law could govern public schools, but it can't govern private schools, which are commercial entities. So you can't tell them they have to integrate. The legislature also has funded a system to give tuition allotments. This notion of education scholarships or tuition, what do they love? Private school tuition grants. This is not a new idea. When Mark Sanford brought it up, it's not a new to Mark Sanford idea. This was in the hopper going all the way back to the 1950s. In 1960, the General Assembly combined everything that funded public education in the state budget into one section of the budget, so that with a single vote, if they needed to, they could close public schools entirely. In 1963, they approved again a tuition grant program to pay private school tuition for parents who opted to take their kids out of integrated public schools and put them in private schools. This act made no reference to race, but it said the program's intent was to give, quote, freedom of choice, unquote, to parents. The language of freedom of choice, education scholarships, is in the news today, literally today. In 1964, the state-funded tuition grant program drew more than 1,000 applications. One of them came from the niece of the segregation committee chairman, Marion Gressett of Calhoun County. Marion Gressett is a curious figure, an important figure, the Lion of the Senate, they called him. He served in the legislature for more than half a century in the House and in the Senate. The state Senate office building today is named the Marion Gressett Senate Office Building. This guy was appointed by Jimmy Burns in 1951 to serve as the chair of the Special Schools Committee, what came to be known as the Segregation Committee. It was a quasi-executive, quasi-legislative committee. It operated behind closed doors, but with public funding, like a legislative committee operates with public funding, except it operated behind closed doors, and no minutes were ever kept of their meetings from 1951 until they disbanded sort of quietly, faded away like mist in the air in the late 1960s, 67 or 68. No minutes ever kept. But out of this committee came all of those dastardly recommendations to do away with public education and to constantly reinforce segregated segregation in public schools. Now, while these strategies were being promulgated by the state legislature, educators themselves, still operating in segregated organizations, began discussions to integrate their organizations and become one. So in 1964, the National Education Association and the American Teachers Association, which was the all-Black corollary to NEA, voted to merge. They became one. And they asked all of their southern state affiliates, who were Black affiliates and white affiliates, to merge at the state level as well, to unite. In South Carolina, that conversation began in 1964. By 67, they had a plan. Both organizations adopted a plan for transition to become one organization. It took 1 year for them to do it. So as of April 1, 1968, educators in South Carolina, for the first time in history, were united under one banner. From 1968 forward, you see an amazing jump in progress in public education. First, those of you who lived here during that time know that integration of schools happened in the late 1960s and early 1970s. By 1971 or 72, all of the public schools in the state had been integrated. It was a sort of a rolling process. But that's not all that they accomplished. In 1972, NEA established a federal political action committee, and it issued its first candidate recommendations. That was in 72. 1 year later, the unified SCEA did exactly the same thing on the state level. So the SCEA's political action committee, at that time, it was called PACE, Political Action Committee for Education, PACE, PACE. Now it's called the Fund for Children in Public Education. It was established in 1973, and they started interviewing candidates and issuing recommendations. In 1974, the SCEA held its 3-day-long spring convention that was attended by more than 5,000 teachers statewide. And when you take into account the number of the tens of thousands of teachers that existed at that time, and that 5,000 of them were not just dues-paying members of the SCEA, but elected delegates from their county affiliates who were coming to the spring convention of the SCEA, it gives you a sense of the power base that Hugh Thompson had inspired to create. There were so many people there that they had their meeting at the state fairgrounds. It was a 3-day convention, had their meeting at the state fairgrounds, and during their 3-day convention, they had political candidates who were their recommended candidates come and speak, deliver a rally, and their political action staff delivered all sorts of trainings on political action to send activists back into their local affiliates, ready to work for their elections in 1974. In 1975, the SCEA hired its first government affairs coordinator, a man named Joe Grant, still lives in Columbia now. He became the first Black man registered to lobby on behalf of integrated educators in state history. In 75, I mean, this is an important and a historical thing. Joe Grant became the first Black lobbyist on behalf of integrated educators in the state. In the spring of 1976, Joe hadn't been on the job for a full year yet. The SCEA interviewed candidates and issued recommendations in both the Republican and Democratic primaries. And in fact, adopted a legislative agenda, the centerpiece of which was legislation that would lead to the state's first statute to fully fund education statewide on an annual basis. Until 1976, the legislature funded public education as it wanted to and as it could. There was nothing in statute saying the legislature will fund it at this level on an annual basis going forward. When in 76, when the SCEA delegates adopted their legislative agenda, this was the crown, this was the gemstone of their legislative agenda. Such was the pace and record of the SCEA successes as an integrated organization from 68 to 76, that you can imagine how powerful individuals in the legislature reacted when they didn't get the educators' recommendations for good reason, and they didn't get activists coming back who had been trained to help them get elected and reelected, yet they still sat in power. They saw an organized educator power base as a danger to them going forward, not just in this year, but going forward, because as educators are more successful, united educators are more successful at getting what they want from the legislature, folks who had conservative leaning tendencies were going to be more and more an endangered species. So in 1976, while the SCEA was doing its good work on one side of town, in downtown Casey, just outside downtown Columbia, a young white teacher who had only taught for a few years, a couple of years up in Seneca, and then a couple more years in Columbia, organized a group of white teachers around her dining room table, and they founded an organization called the Palmetto State Teachers Association. This young woman was a woman named Elizabeth Gressett. She was the niece of Segregation Committee Chairman Marion Gressett. In 1976, PSTA adopts its governing documents. In their literature, they promote themselves as against collective bargaining, which was part of the legislative agenda of the SCEA, against strikes, against taking any job action that would disrupt the school day, disrupt the school year, and that would hold the state hostage to the will and whims of organized educators. That was their calling card. They got themselves founded. They started recruiting members. And from that moment forward, from 1976 forward, you see a constant diminution of the impact of organized educators in the state because educators were no longer united. That began the splintering. colleague just asked me a few weeks ago, do you really believe that that was the beginning? Absolutely, that was the beginning. In 1977, we succeeded at getting the Education Finance Act passed. That was the first statute that fully funded education on an annual basis. But after that, what did we accomplish? Dick Riley got reelected, used all of his political capital and the SCEA's support to pass the Education Improvement Act and add a penny to the state sales tax in 1984. But then we failed. Educators failed because we were not united anymore to elect a progressive candidate to succeed Dick Riley. We failed at that. We elected Carol Campbell instead. And what we got after electing Carol Campbell was not public education for the public good. It was instead, what alternatives can we create to public education in the state? Fast forward to 1998, the legislature passed the Education Accountability Act, which created for the first time the Education Oversight Committee. The Education Oversight Committee was created in that act, in the EAA in 1998, for a specific purpose. You may remember in the 1990s, conservatives and even conservative Democrats got on board with this standards and accountability movement across the country. Started, in fact, under the Bush administration in the early 90s, late 80s and early 90s. Standards and accountability meant now we're going to apply standardized testing in public schools. And if you don't meet a certain threshold in standardized test scores, then you're going to be punished. So the Education Oversight Commission was created in 1998 to oversee the state's implementation of standardized testing. It was sunsetted after 5 years. The EOC would go out of existence after 5 years. But during the 5 years, the first 5 years that it existed, conservatives in the legislature figured out that they could use the EOC as an alternative to the State Board of Education. The state chamber figured out that through appointment power of the governor and the speaker and the president pro tem of the Senate, they could get business people appointed to the EOC, which they couldn't necessarily get to the State Board of Education. So they saw the EOC as their engine for pushing their agenda more effectively than they could manipulate the State Board of Education. And so in the early 2000s, they eliminated the EOC's sunset clause from the EAA. This is why the Education Oversight Commission exists still today and is dominated by the state chamber, the state business community, and, well, you know that the current chair of the EOC, a woman named Ellen Weaver, was just elected as the state superintendent of education. Now, when I talk about the founding of PSTA being founded as a group of disgruntled white educators who did not want to be a part of an integrated organization anymore. As I say everywhere I say this, don't take my word for it. John Hale was a professor of history at the College of Charleston from 2010, I think, to 2020 or so. He wrote on this subject and published an article in the West Virginia Law Review, and in it he quoted Elizabeth Gressett herself. He got an interview with her on the telephone. She laid it all out for him. It was white women, white educators who did not want to be a part of an integrated organization who founded PSTA, founded it as an anti-collective bargaining, anti-union alternative to the SCEA. So you don't have to listen to what I say. John Hale and his article online says it for me. Now, curiously, let me say one more thing about what the legislature did to neuter the SCEA and organized educators in the state. In 1981, this is a small thing, but it's significant. In 1981, the legislature acted to strip the SCEA's members of their right to pay their membership dues by payroll deduction. Now, almost everybody in the state has the right to deduct certain monies from their paychecks through payroll deduction to pay to charitable organizations or professional organizations at the will. if you've ever donated to the United Way on a regular basis, you can do that through payroll deduction, have a little bit of money taken out of your check each month. To this very day, the State Law Enforcement Officers Association can use payroll deduction. The State Wildlife Officers Association can use payroll deduction. The State Employees Association can use payroll deduction, but members of the SCEA cannot. And the mechanism that lawmakers used to strip this right from educators who were members of the SCEA was to say, the language is quite clever, it's simple but clever, that this payroll deduction will not be available to members to have dues paid to any organization that is affiliated with a national organization. Well, the SCEA is an affiliate of the National Education Association. All of these other state-based organizations that are only state-based organizations can use payroll deduction all they want. Now, as I said, this may sound like a small thing, but in fact, it can be a crippling thing, because in essence, when you tell educators in the early 1980s that you can no longer use payroll deduction, instead you have to pay cash to your professional association, or you have to write a check every month. Later, when credit cards became more ubiquitous, you can use your credit card to pay your membership dues on a monthly basis. And nowadays, EFT, electronic fund transfer, is another option available. But in essence, what the legislature did was to tell educators who were members of the SCEA, you have to choose on a monthly basis to rejoin your organization. It's no longer going to be as easy as just saying at the beginning of the school year, take my dues out and pay the SCEA. Now you have to decide on a monthly basis, do you want to be a member of this organization or not? And that's why I say it can be potentially crippling. Now, curiously, while PSTA cussed the SCEA for being part of NEA all those years, from its very beginning, PSTA itself aligned itself and became, this is their word for it, affiliated with an organization, a national organization called Concerned Educators Against Forced Unionism, CEAFU. If you look up CEAFU online, you'll find their archive of published newsletters, and you'll see in their archive of published newsletters who they get their money from. They get their money from the National Right to Work Legal Defense and Education Foundation, funding from David and Charles Koch, the Walton Family Foundation, the Coors Family's Castle Rock Foundation, Wisconsin's Bradley Foundation, the John Olin Foundation. All of these organizations purposefully work against public education, the public good, and on behalf of private interests and entities. That brings me up to, I think, this year, and I'll just touch very briefly on what happened in the legislature, the education race this year. For the first time in memory, in fact, it could be the first time in state history, you had a practicing classroom educator running for the office of State Superintendent of Education. Her name was Lisa Ellis. She lives in Blythewood. She teaches, I think, in Richland, one of the Richland school districts. She was running on the Democratic ticket. On the Republican side, you had Kathy Maness, who was Elizabeth Gressett's successor as executive director of PSTA, running against Ellen Weaver, whose only job as an adult has ever been as executive director of Jim DeMent's Palmetto Promise Institute up in Greenville. Weaver grew up on Bob Jones University's campus. Her father was a professor there. She literally grew up on its campus, which doesn't make it sound strange then that when she discovered you have to have a master's degree to be state superintendent of education, she called Bob Jones University, and Bob Jones quickly enrolled her in a, you too can have a master's degree in 6-month program. And so apparently she's going to collect her degree sometime this week or next week. A master's degree in 6 months when everybody else takes 2 years. In the only debate that Weaver held with Maness, if you did not see it, it was only broadcast over Facebook Live. If you didn't see it, Weaver mocked Maness, who she knew to be a rabid anti-unionist, as a union leader, because Maness leads an organization of educators. And of course, when presented with a choice between a divider of educators and a dismantler of public education, Republicans chose Weaver in the Republican primary by a significant margin. That set up the campaign between Weaver and Ellis in the general election. And the good news is that Lisa Ellis garnered more votes for state superintendent of education this year than any candidate who had ever run before had garnered. Those of you who have been around a while may remember Charlie Williams served in that capacity for several terms. Charlie Williams is extremely popular in that position. She got more votes than him, more votes than Barbara Nielsen, more votes than Inez Tenenbaum, more votes than Jim Rex, Mick Zase, Molly Spearman. And yet the vote count that she got came to only 42.7% of the votes cast in that race. Ellen Weaver got 55.6% of the total votes cast in that race. I cannot help but wonder how many of those votes came from educators and educators' mothers and fathers and educators' spouses, husbands and wives, adult children, as a result of the splintering of our profession in South Carolina. When I say splintering, since 1976, of course, there have been two organizations of educators in the state, the SCEA and PSTA. But since 2018, there has now been a third organization in the state, and that's the grassroots organization that calls itself SC4Ed. And in fact, that was the organization co-founded by Lisa Ellis herself. So the splintering that I refer to now means three organizations anyway. Not all of them have a presence in every single county. But in my opinion, it's the splintering of the profession as represented by three, not one anymore, but three organizations of educators with sometimes overlapping legislative interests and sometimes competing legislative interests that resulted in our constant failures. I asked in my essay after election night and again now, what lessons do we take from our record of consistent failure at electing pro-public education candidates? What lessons do we take? The lessons are there for those who want to learn them. And I'm not confident tonight that we've learned a great deal from those lessons. After the Republican primary, Kathy Maness, after being beaten by Weaver, went right back to her job as the executive director of PSTA a month ago. In fact, just last week, we got an announcement that Lisa Ellis, having lost in her campaign for the office in November, has now gone back to her role as executive director of SC4Ed. Today, I received a copy of a new booklet. I put it in the chat box earlier. It's a 60-some page booklet, a handbook they call it, issued by the Palmetto Promise Institute. This is Weaver's organization. That's titled Education or Indoctrination: How National Education Organizations and Their Allies Target South Carolina's Teachers, Students, and Parents. Now, Brett cast part of the conversation tonight as a conversation about building a community-based campaign to support teachers in public education in the state. And as I thought about what I would propose and promote, four things come to mind. One, we ought to, people of good conscience, ought to promote public education as a public good in every narrative that we use, and celebrate what public schools have accomplished despite being sorely and consistently underfunded, and especially celebrate what graduates of public schools have achieved for and in our communities. That's first. Second, we ought to, all of us knows educators or know people who know educators. We go to church with them, we are part of civic functions with them, etc. We ought to reach out to public school educators to promote membership in the SCEA, to promote the SCEA for its history and its legislative agenda. Keep in mind that every single employee of a public school district, that includes superintendents, that includes licensed and certified educators, and it includes unlicensed and uncertified public school district employees, which includes everybody who works in a school site, food service workers, transportation workers, folks at the bus barn, bus mechanics, skilled tradesmen. Who am I missing? Custodial, janitorial, and custodial staff, secretarial and clerical staff. Everybody who works in a school site is eligible for membership in the SCEA. Unfortunately, that does not include employees of contractors who have been contracted by school districts to work in their school districts. So in a number of districts in the state, food service and transportation, bus drivers specifically, are hired by a third-party contractor. And they, because they are not employed directly by the school district, are not eligible for membership. Every other school district employee is eligible for membership in the SCEA. That includes employees of public charter schools and public virtual schools. So if you know folks in that category, they too. Third, I would encourage everybody to reach out to leaders of county affiliates of the SCEA and offer to create partnerships for our mutual benefit. Educators live and work in every zip code of the state, every county of the state, and our agenda is to accomplish greater good in every zip code in every county in the state. So there's a natural affinity between our agendas and our groups. And then fourth, here's something I just learned from the SCEA very recently, that we, even though we are not practicing educators ourselves as individuals, can join the SCEA as what they call an associate member. This is a brand new membership category. I say brand new. It's not very old. A membership category, the associate membership. I think that the annual dues are $25. So that entitles you to get all of the communications that they send out by mail, and you get on their email list. And so you see and hear what is going on at the SCEA. Brett, I know that was a long diatribe, for lack of a better word. More information than folks needed to know, perhaps. But I think that understanding where we've come from and how we got here and the forces at play gives us a foundation to have some conversation about what we can do and ought to do.